We live in an increasingly divided world where our political parties, religious convictions, and personal identities are used to polarize and pit us against one another. As the ancient prophets wrote, a house divided cannot stand. This division is literally tearing our world apart. The only path to create true and lasting healing in our world is to come together with civility, respect, and honesty, sharing our stories and discussing our perspectives across our deepest divides. Welcome to the Patchwork Podcast with author, pastor, and activist Brandon Robertson. In every episode, we seek to cultivate compelling conversations to help bring clarity and understanding to some of the most controversial topics of our day, with the hope of bridging our collective divides one conversation at a time. So thank you for joining us on this journey together. Let's listen to this week's conversation.
Well, welcome back to the Patchwork Podcast. It's Brandon Robertson here. And if you're alive and been around over the past 4 to 8 years of American history, you'll know that our country is in perhaps one of the most polarized periods in recent history. Of course, we've had seasons of great polarization in American history. I think of the Civil War. I think around World War II. But no moment has felt as gridlocked, and historians tend to agree that this is perhaps one of the most politically gridlocked moments that we've seen in the history of our country. And it's easy for those of us who are looking from the sidelines and watching these politicians engage in what feels like a reality show more often than not, to feel kind of hopeless about what the future of our country is. Are we ever going to be able to work together, or is it going to be this back and forth game of political movement forward when one party holds the presidency and then push back when the next party gains the presidency? It's a confusing, perplexing, frustrating time for us all. But in this moment, there are a number of scholars and experts around the country who have risen up with the desire to help us understand that perhaps even though things publicly look pretty bad a lot of the time, that what's actually happening on the ground is not quite as stark. Yes, we are a polarized nation, but when we're actually talking about the electorate, the people on the ground, you and me, we're not as divided as the media would want us to believe that we are. And in fact, we can actually have a little bit of hope that on state government levels and local government levels, we can actually create the change that will actually impact our lives and our communities. So on that same note, today I had the great opportunity of sitting down and chatting with Matt Grossman. And Dr. Grossman is the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University and is a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. He's a regular commentator to 538 and has published analysis in New York Times, The Washington Post, and Politico, and he hosts a Science and Politics podcast. He's the author of a new book called Red State Blues, and a book that I talk a lot about in this interview called Asymmetric Politics, which he wrote with Dr. David Hopkins in 2016. He is an insightful political scholar and analyst who really has done a lot of work to outline what's going wrong in our two-party system and how our politics are truly imbalanced, how the Republican Party is increasingly insular focused and the Democratic Party is increasingly focused on demographic diversity, and how those two things working against each other are creating kind of this gridlock situation that we're in. And so I was really excited to be able to sit down and talk to Dr. Grossman, pick his brain a bit about the hows and the whys of this current situation, the how of how did we get here, and the why of why doesn't anything seem to be changing. And throughout most of his answers, I found reason to be hopeful, a reason to think that perhaps the future of our country might not be quite as polarized as it currently seems. And so, without further ado, I'm really excited for you to listen into my conversation with Dr. Matt Grossman, the author of Asymmetric Politics and Red State Blues. Well, first and foremost, How does one get into this field? How did you spark interest in this field of public policy and social research? And like, what keeps somebody jumping into these often mucky and confusing waters?
Well, from the time I was a child, I've been paying attention to politics and the news and wanting to know more about what went into national politics and policy and state and local politics and policy. My parents were sort of involved from the margins, and I took that as a starting point. And then when I went to college and graduate school, I became more interested in the research side. Oops. And what it could provide. And so I have long been interested in public policy and politics, and I have recently taken over a research institute at Michigan State University, where I got to do a little bit on the practical side. We're sort of the primary outreach vehicle to state government, so I get to talk to legislators and legislative staff all of the time, but also keep my toes in the research side to learn about what's going on across time and across states and across the nation.
Totally. It sounds like you got the best of both worlds there. That's awesome. And so, kind of jumping in, the big question that I think a lot of your work recently and a lot of interviews you've done recently has centered around a question that we're all kind of thinking about. And it's that we're in what a lot of people are saying is perhaps one of the most divided eras in American history, polarized politically on opposite sides of the spectrum. I wonder if you can give a little insight into what you think is causing, in this moment, the severe polarization, and if you see a path forward for us in the future.
Well, I think people should recognize the good news. That is that people are more informed about politics. They know the differences between the two major political parties and the two major sides of political conflict. They know how to connect their own ideas to candidates and political officials to make voting decisions that match their preferences. So even though the consequences sometimes don't look great for civility and for coming to consensus, they do start with a more informed electorate and one that is better able to make its choices match their beliefs. I think some of the problems that we have stem from our inability to understand the other side and its motivations, and our frustration that policy outcomes don't seem to match what kinds of political consensus we believe there is in the world. Part of that is because we think that other people must think like us. And so we're sort of frustrated when our own views aren't represented to the degree we think they should be in government. But part of it is also just that the process doesn't look very nice from afar or even from close up. And so we're frustrated when it looks like politicians are not aiming for the public good, even when what they're doing is reconciling the different choices and the different values that we've sent them to represent.
Totally. And I've heard you and read a little bit about you talking about this, but do you think this political polarization, it's definitely there, it seems, among elected officials, and it seems in the media, everything seems polarized. But do you think that the general public is as divided as we're being led to believe?
Well, we are not as divided as elites. That is, people still hold some opinions contrary to their political party or ideological perspective. People often place themselves in the middle of scales that we give them about whether we should go one way or the other. So there are people who are in the middle or have mixed opinions, but there are also an increasing number of people who line up clearly on one side or the other, and separate from that, there are some people who hold extreme positions on individual issues. So it's not a fully pretty picture, but it's also the case that we're not as divided as our politicians.
And do you ever see hope for like a third party actually emerging in the United States?
Well, the constraints on third parties are institutional rather than kind of beliefs or views. So there are plenty of people who hold, for example, views similar to the Libertarian Party or the Green Party or some of the others third parties that we have. But our electoral system really makes it difficult for those third parties to compete effectively. And so, we tend to have two political parties, and the parties that we have had that have kind of broken that have tended to be regional parties that can survive in our geographic electoral system.
Totally. Yeah, it just seems, again, that in this polarized moment, that it would serve us well, perhaps, to have a few more moderates finally coming forward again, or just some people that can at least maybe paint the best of both sides and hold it together in a single candidate or single party. But as you said, it just feels like the system is set up to make it really hard for those parties and politicians to actually have a shot at making influence in our country.
Well, I will say that we do still have bipartisan compromises and bipartisan nationwide trends. So sometimes we underestimate it because they get less attention, and even in very conflict-ridden areas. So, for example, under President Trump, we had a bipartisan consensus around criminal justice reform, which is kind of the opposite consensus that we had 20 years ago, where we kind of moved toward more strict criminal justice policies with longer sentences, and nationwide, both in the states and at the federal level, we are kind of turning the page on that era to try to reduce mass incarceration. And that isn't, you wouldn't think that that would be possible given the kinds of rhetoric that you sometimes hear coming out of politicians on each side, but we have been doing it. In the states, for example, we have been expanding early childhood education pretty much nationwide. Republican governors have taken credit for that when it's occurred in their states as well. And it's based on some useful research trends that show that intervening early and making sure that kids have the capacity to start elementary school at roughly the same level is important and can be achieved. And so politicians often on both sides do follow the research trends and the public opinion when they move together.
Totally. So it sounds like you're saying that there's kind of, not to put it this crassly, but there's a political showmanship that happens in the public and in the media, but actually behind the scenes, there is actually more, maybe not a lot, but more bipartisanship happening than we might expect.
Yeah, it usually takes both parties to get anything passed, and so at the federal level, that sometimes means we don't see much passed, but the things that are passed tend to have support from both parties, and even in the states, and even in places where one party controls everything, you still see a majority of bills passed with bipartisan support. So it isn't the polarized system doesn't kind of encompass everything. There's still a lot going on that we hear less about.
Totally. And as we're in this season where the Democrats are running for their primaries, and we're in this season where we have a lot of political candidates talking about a lot of different issues and offering different perspectives, even being a part of the Democratic Party, it's kind of highlighting this reality that often political candidates don't necessarily represent the platform of the parties that they're trying to run for. And I know you've written a little bit about that, this kind of asymmetry between the candidates running for office and then once they get into office, what their platforms become. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think the one useful thing for the public to know is that we kind of have contrary preferences, and they give each political party an advantage in winning over our votes. We tend to have conservative predispositions, but liberal policy positions. So the easiest examples of this are on spending. We think the government should spend less and be smaller overall, except we'd like it to spend more in education and healthcare and environment and everything else. Same with regulation. We think it would be good if we didn't have a big regulatory state, but we want environmental quality, we want consumer regulation, we want all of the things that the government does in specific terms. So that means that each party is sort of better off in a very different image to present to voters. The Republicans are better off talking about, in broad terms, the size and scope of government, the direction of society, the role of the U.S. nation in the world, and Democrats are better off talking about specific benefits that people might receive from government, and specific policies that are designed to solve specific problems. So we see very different messages presented to voters, but they correspond with what we like most about each political party.
Totally. And kind of digging into that, the party's messages and what they're known for, especially again in your book, Asymmetric Politics, that you wrote with David Hopkins, I found it super insightful just to see the different ways Republicans and Democrats are interacting, organizing, and engaging publicly. And so your book title kind of spells out that the Republican Party is a vehicle for an ideological movement, and the Democratic Party is more of a coming together of multiple different social groups with social interests. Can you talk a bit about that? Is that an accurate perception of the two parties still? Is Republican still the small government party, and Democrat still focusing on big government? Is that where we're at?
In self-conception, the Republican Party is definitely a party of symbolic ideology. When you ask Republicans why they support their party and oppose the Democrats, they talk in broad terms about liberalism and socialism and its dangers, too much social change and its dangers, trying to become like other countries and those dangers, and all of the restoration that the Republican Party will bring about, the smaller government that Republican Party will bring about. When you ask Democrats why they support their party and dislike the other party, they tend to talk in group terms. They say that the Republicans are the party of whites and rich people, and Democrats are the party of various minority groups and the poor and the middle class. And so the justifications people give for their involvement in the parties is different, and it also shows up in the organization of the parties. Republicans tend to organize in kind of broad ideological factions and organizations alongside the conservative movement, for example, whereas Democrats tend to organize based on social identities and specific single issue groups. And so Democratic politicians have to kind of compile all of these different demands of their constituencies, whereas Republican politicians tend to sort of talk less specifically, but have the more difficult problem in some sense of trying to kind of achieve this change in the scope of government and its role in our society.
Totally. And I know Asymmetric Politics, it came out in 2016, so it was kind of a little bit before this even more intensified political period that we're in now. And you've kind of touched on this already in the past two answers, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into the way that the parties are actually fundamentally different in some ways. And you've talked about there's this growing demographic diversity on the Democratic side of things. The people who are identifying as Democrats, it seems, at least in the message, that, as you said, this is a party of minorities. This is a party with a lot of diversity, and the Republican side is a little bit more monolithic, or at least that's the perception. And it also seems like, and I believe you talk about this in the book, that the Republicans are a bit more insular focused. But I imagine that there's on that, both sides need to do a little bit of maneuvering if we're actually going to have any political trajectory forward. It would seem that Republicans would have to politically, just from a strategy standpoint, begin to engage more with the demographic diversity that's around the country and that's ever increasing, and that Democrats would need to actually focus a little bit more on the insular side of things that Republicans have been so traditionally known to focus on. I don't know if that made complete sense, but can you comment on that?
Certainly, the Democrats are the more diverse party in terms of ethnicity and race, in terms of religion, in terms of ideology, and in pretty much all the all the manifestations of diversity compared to the Republican Party. Um, that has long been thought as one reason why perhaps there's some emerging Democratic majority coming, because young people are more liberal, because the country is growing more diverse. It hasn't yet turned out that way, because alongside that diversification, there has been a larger segment that sees itself as either losing out in that process or kind of against the direction of social change. And that's not unique to the US either. It turns out that all over the world, across the Western world, societies are diversifying. They're getting more educated. Young people have more liberal views, specifically on social issues, and yet that hasn't produced a kind of triumph for the left. And the reason is that as diversity comes, it tends to come with more demands on the left to do more, to recognize that diversity and to equalize chances and outcomes. And that tends to provoke a backlash against immigration, against increasing social change. That means that that the parties of the right don't necessarily lose out in the context of that social change.
Okay, so totally. And I was going to ask you this. We know a little bit that we saw Brexit happen in the UK, then we saw Trump happen here, and now we know kind of in different nations around the world, there is this, as you were talking about, this kind of conservative backlash to the push forward of progressive values. But is this polarization that we've become so accustomed to in the United States, is that a more global reality right now, or is that just limited to the West? Or I just wonder if you have any insight about whether this trend is more localized to our part of the world, or if this is happening everywhere.
Well, partisan polarization is somewhat unique in the U.S. because we have two big parties and no no small parties, and they're well aligned with ideological viewpoints and policy viewpoints, and that's not true everywhere. But it's hard to separate, but it's important to separate that a little bit from just kind of social polarization in general. So one would not call the party system in Britain polarized, for example, because each of the major parties faces major threats from new parties. But of course, it is socially polarized on this question of whether the UK should leave the European Union and under what circumstances. So we're seeing that kind of social polarization everywhere, but it's not as closely tied to the parties as it is in the US.
Totally. And I know, again, we've talked about some of this already, but it just seems like the United States, because of the restrictions we have on parties and how parties can form and how they have power, and that we've kind of acknowledged these two parties, it almost feels like this is potentially one of the weak parts and potentially the downfall of this particular experiment in democracy, that when you have this hyper polarized, hyper ideologized country, that it's really hard to create progress and create any sense where we can actually move forward. And I just wonder, as you're looking at the 2020 elections as they're beginning to take shape, especially obviously on the Democratic side, is there anything new that you see looking at it and analyzing what's happening? Is there any candidates or messaging that's being presented that could be helpful to heal some of this asymmetry and this polarization? Or do you think that we're in for business as usual for the next couple years, couple presidential cycles?
Well, certainly our institutions are set up to promote business as usual. So it's unlikely that either party will gain a majority that lasts for longer than 2 years and encompasses the House and the Senate and the presidency. And when they do gain power in the national government, they tend to lose power in the midterm elections and the state elections. So, I think this search for kind of a permanent victory for one side is unlikely. And what that means is that but the kinds of policies that are likely to pass are the kinds that draw from each political party. But there's sort of been a breakdown in what used to allow that to happen on the policy side. What we used to do is implement things that mainly benefited Democratic constituencies, new policies, but we used to do them in as Republican way as possible. So we often deferred to state governments. We often used the tax code rather than direct spending to try to incentivize behavior. We often used private contractors or competition instead of the government itself to deliver services. And all of that was kind of a grand compromise between what liberals were trying to achieve and the means that conservatives were most comfortable achieving it. But that has broken down. Conservatives have now just sort of been against new government action, no matter how it is formatted. And Democrats have been less likely to kind of accept that bargain as they've seen things like the Affordable Care Act, which implemented a lot of those kinds of compromises, been sort of no more popular with Republicans than another approach. They've kind of gone back to pursuing, maybe the what they prefer. And so you're seeing that a little bit play out in the Democratic electorate. Bernie Sanders is a unique candidate compared to Democratic campaigns from afar. He draws more from what's going on in other countries. He self-defines as a Democratic socialist. So all that is pretty unique. Elizabeth Warren is less unique in her style, but she has presented a lot of new policy proposals that are substantially to the left of the Democratic norm. Joe Biden is sort of running on Barack Obama's third term, so not a whole lot of change there. But yeah, you're seeing some signs of change, but nothing that is likely to result in policy making that looks dramatically different than what we have seen.
Cool. I think that's a good read. And just this might be out of left field, but not as a partisan person, but from where you're standing and from the way you're able to analyze the electorate and what's happening in our country. Do you have any insight into how you see the 2020 election going?
I think we are close to a 50-50 nation, and people should sort of realize that there's not one grand winner, and that public opinion tends to go against the direction of policymaking. So that is, we actually had conservative trends in public opinion under Barack Obama, and now we have liberal trends in public opinion under President Trump. So I don't think we're going to get kind of one grand victory. I think the most likely outcome is that the Republicans retain control of the Senate and the Democrats win the presidency, such that gridlock continues to some degree. But I also think we should shift our expectations a bit. Some of my work in the states, for example, and in other work has shown that there are differences between Democratic and Republican governance, but they're not nearly as dramatic as what is portrayed on the campaign trail. So by one measurement, for example, of the distance between Democrats and Republicans as expressed in their campaign messages, a couple of years of Democratic governance is likely to move it about 1% further towards the Democratic ideal than the Republican ideal. So there's movement. The politicians do respond to election results, but it's not something that's going to change the scope of government overnight.
Wow. That 1%. Yeah. I mean, that's a little hope, but also a little disconcerting that I think you're right. We obviously, as the public, stake a lot of hope on the grandiose promises of candidates from either side, and what can actually be accomplished is much less. And I think having that perspective is probably helpful, but I don't think very many people do grasp a hold of that perspective. And kind of to land the airplane, I just wanted to ask, I know you've been engaged in teaching public policy, and you have had a chance to interact kind of with the general public, with students who are just beginning to think about public policy and the American electorate and how our government works. I just wonder if there's like one takeaway, one big lesson that if you could shout it out to the entire American public and get us to see something that we're not seeing. I wonder if there's one general message that you want to communicate.
I think my messages would be different for liberals and conservatives. I think what liberals need to hear is that they are winning a long-term battle to slowly expand the role of government and accept social change. But it is very slow. So, if you look at changes in social issues, on things like gay rights and drugs, you find dramatic social trends over the last 20 years or so moving in the liberal direction. And if you look at the size and scope of government, you also see both states and nationally, government taking on new roles, trying to solve new problems, spending more money, regulating more. And those are slow trends. They are not going to get us to Medicare for all or the Green New Deal anytime soon. But they do tend to move, policy does tend to move in a liberal direction over time. And so that, I think, will help them understand that conservatives see themselves as sort of losing this battle. And that's why they often react in an alarmist way to what seem like pretty small shifts in government and in society. I think for the conservative side, I think what they need to hear is that the sort of way that the public expresses its kind of general sentiments about government and society is not the same as their actual opinions on policy issues. And so anytime someone tries to carry out an actual reduction in the size and scope of government, it is very unpopular. So, for example, in Kansas, where they cut taxes dramatically and had to cut school funding as a result, people saw closed schools. They saw less healthcare delivered. They saw, fewer resources for roads, and those things are very unpopular in practice. And so, the vision that conservatives are able to sell to the public is a popular vision, but it doesn't mean that it's actually kind of an achievable policy vision that people can come away with pleased with.
Totally. Those are good messages. And I do just want to say, Dr. Grossman, thank you for taking time today to chat with me, but also for writing these books, Red State Blues and Asymmetric Politics, both super helpful. And I hope those who are listening will definitely check them out and learn a little bit more about what is happening in our country in this moment. And again, I'm just grateful that you've created these resources and taken time to be with us.
Great. Thanks for having me.
The Patchwork Podcast is brought to you in part by Metanoia, a center for spiritual and social renewal, and Mission Gathering San Diego, a progressive, inclusive Christian church.